"I know the answer," said the black janitor to the billionaire CEO, and taught him what no one else could. The Technova meeting room looked like a battlefield after defeat. Red graphs dominated the giant screen, catastrophic numbers flashed like emergency alerts, and the heavy silence was broken only by the creaking of leather chairs when someone moved nervously. Roberto Silva, billionaire CEO of the country's largest software company, held his head in his hands. Her words came out as a desperate whisper, 48 hours. If we don't fix this flaw in the banking system, we lose the $200 million contract with the central bank. The company will go bankrupt. The 15 highest-paid engineers in Brazil were there, each earning more than $30,000 a month, and none had an answer. The code that controlled financial transactions had developed a critical flaw that no one could locate. 3 weeks of working 24 hours a day, and the system continued to crash every 1,000 operations. Then a calm voice cut through the despair. "It is his knowledge where the problem is." All faces turned toward the door. There stood Carlos Mendez, 52 years old, his blue janitor's uniform still damp with sweat from work, holding a squeegee in one hand and a worn notebook in the other. His tired eyes had the strange serenity of someone who had weathered much worse storms. Dr. Anderson Whitman, the newly arrived chief technology officer from an American multinational, laughed contemptuously. "Really? Now janitors understand programming." Carlos was unfazed. He simply walked over to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and drew a diagram that made 3 engineers lean forward. "The flaw isn't in the new code," he said firmly. "It's in the integration with the legacy system. You've been looking in the wrong place for 3 weeks." Roberto slowly raised his head, his eyes red from exhaustion fixed on the man who had been cleaning his office for 5 years and whom he barely noticed existed. "Go on," he muttered. Carlos pointed to a specific line in the code projected on the wall. "Here. For every 1,000 transactions, the memory buffer isn't being completely cleared. A residue of data remains that corrupts the next operation. That's why the error only appears after exactly 1,000 processes." The silence in the room changed in quality. It was no longer despair, it was shocked surprise. Anderson Whitman crossed his arms, his face red with indignation. "That's absurd. How could a janitor know something that our team of experts couldn't figure out?" Carlos looked Anderson straight in the eye, unhurried, without anger. Because sometimes those on the outside see what those on the inside can't see. If you're enjoying this story of twists and justice, don't forget to subscribe to his channel, because what will happen when they find out who Carlos really is will leave everyone speechless. Anderson Whitman crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Look, folks, we have a computer genius disguised as a janitor. How about showing us her academic credentials, Carlos? MIT? Stanford? Or maybe the University of Life?" Nervous laughter echoed around the room. Some engineers looked away, embarrassed, but Anderson was just getting started. He stood up and walked over to Carlos, deliberately invading his personal space in an intimidating manner. "You know what I think? I think you overheard some of our conversations in the bathroom and are trying to make yourself look important. Because honestly, a man in his 40s pushing a squeegee didn't get a college degree for some reason, right?" Carlos remained impassive, his fingers lightly squeezing the worn notebook. Roberto watched the scene with growing discomfort, but before he could intervene, Anderson continued his attack. "Let me guess," Anderson said, turning dramatically around Carlos. "You took a few online courses and now you think you're an expert? Watched some YouTube videos on programming? Because look, buddy, we have master's and doctorate degrees here. I personally have 15 years of experience in Silicon Valley." That's when Carlos spoke, her voice low but firm. "I also had 15 years of experience. Before." The before hung in the air like a ghost. Anderson stopped circling, intrigued in spite of himself. Before what? Carlos looked directly into Anderson's eyes, and for a second, something passed between them, a spark of recognition that made the American recoil unconsciously. "Before I discovered that a single moment of naivety can destroy an entire life." Roberto leaned forward. "Carlos, can his tell us?" "I was a senior systems architect at Dataflow Solutions," Carlos said simply. 15 years building the algorithms that now control banking transactions in 12 countries. I had a team of 20 engineers under my supervision, a house in a gated community, an imported car. A perfect life, as you would say. The silence in the room changed completely. Anderson frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. Carlos continued, her voice maintaining that disturbing calm. Until the day I trusted the wrong person. A partner who needed a scapegoat to cover up a $2 million fraud. I was accused of embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, conspiracy. 3 years of legal proceedings ate up all his savings. Even when he was cleared, his reputation was destroyed. Roberto swallowed hard. My God. Do you know what happens when you're fired on suspicion of fraud, Dr. Silva? Even if you're acquitted? No tech company will hire him. His name is blacklisted in the market. His wife files for divorce because she can't handle the social pressure. His children are ashamed of their father. In 6 months, he loses his house, his car, his family, everything. Anderson shook his head, visibly uncomfortable. Look, that's a sad story, but it doesn't change the fact that... What doesn't change, Carlos interrupted him gently, is that you've been looking for a needle in the wrong haystack for 3 weeks. And I know exactly where she is. He approached the whiteboard again and wrote a sequence of code that made 2 engineers look at each other in surprise. Buffer overflow on line 347 of the integration module. The legacy system uses dynamic memory allocation, but you implemented static cleanup. Every 1,000 operations, 1 corrupted byte remains and contaminates the next cycle. Dr. Patricia Santos, the most experienced engineer on the team, leaned forward. Wait a minute, if he's right, that would explain exactly the pattern of failures we're seeing. Anderson watched the expression of growing recognition on the team's faces and felt his authority slipping through his fingers. This is ridiculous. We're not going to redesign our system based on the theory of a janitor, Carlos finished, without showing any offense. I know what I am today, Dr. Whitman. The difference is that I also know what I used to be. And more importantly, I know exactly what you did wrong. Roberto banged his fist on the table, determined. Let's test his theory. Now. Roberto, you're crazy. Anderson protested. We can't. We can and we will, Roberto cut him off. Patricia, implement the correction Carlos suggested in the test environment. I want to see the results in an hour. Anderson watched the team mobilize around Carlos' suggestion, her face red with indignation. He had been challenged by a janitor in front of the entire team, and worse, it seemed that the janitor might be right. As Carlos stood there, holding his worn notebook with his usual serenity, something shone in his eyes that neither Roberto nor Anderson could quite decipher. It wasn't anger, it wasn't triumph. It was something much more dangerous. It was the calculated patience of someone who had learned that the best revenge is not served hot, but at just the right temperature to burn without leaving visible scars. Every arrogant word from Anderson, every contemptuous laugh, every attempt at humiliation was being carefully filed away in the mind of a man who had already lost everything once and knew exactly what defeat tasted like. But what Anderson couldn't see behind that calm was that Carlos wasn't just trying to solve a technical problem. He was planting the seeds of something much bigger, something that would transform that company forever. An hour later, the test room was filled with tension. The screens showed the results of Carlos's fix, and the numbers were impossible to ignore. 0 failures in 5,000 simulated transactions. The system that had consistently crashed for 3 weeks now worked perfectly. Patricia Santos looked up from the screen, impressed. My God, he was right, her. The buffer overflow was exactly where he said it would be. How did you manage to identify that, Carlos? Anderson Whitman watched the results with his face growing redder and redder. Her authority, carefully built up over 15 years, was being demolished by a janitor in front of the entire team. Wait a minute, he said, forcing a nervous smile. A lab test proves nothing. Real systems are much more complex. Carlos remained calm, still holding his worn notebook. Do you want me to show you where else you went wrong? More mistakes? Roberto leaned forward, intrigued. Carlos walked over to the board and began to draw. The backup system also has a critical flaw. If a power outage occurs during a high-priority transaction, you will lose data permanently. And the security protocol has a vulnerability that any intermediate hacker could exploit in less than 10 minutes. The yellowed pages were covered with complex diagrams, handwritten code, and detailed analyses of banking systems. Because I never stopped studying, he said simply. 5 years of cleaning offices gave me access to a lot of interesting information. Conversations people have when they think no one is listening. Documents left on desks. Open systems on computers. Anderson felt a chill run down his spine. His were spying on us? I was working, Carlos replied with that disturbing calm. And observing. You talk too loudly when you think you're invisible to the cleaning staff. Especially late at night, when you're frustrated with problems you can't solve. Roberto began to understand the magnitude of the situation. Carlos, do you have solutions to all these problems? I do. And I have something even more interesting. Carlos turned a page in his notebook, revealing a detailed diagram. A complete design for a new bank security system. Something that would reduce operating costs by 60% and increase processing speed by 200%. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia approached the notebook, his eyes scanning the complex calculations. This is brilliant. Where did you get these ideas? From sleepless nights, cleaning empty offices, and thinking about how I would do things differently. Carlos closed the notebook gently. 5 years is enough time to develop some theories. Anderson could no longer contain his frustration. This is absurd. Roberto, you can't be thinking of taking this seriously. This man is a janitor. He has no credentials, no formal experience, nothing but barroom theories. He has results, Roberto said dryly. Something we couldn't achieve in 3 weeks, he solved in 5 minutes. Anderson approached Carlos, invading his personal space again. You know what I think? That you're a fraud. That you stole this information from somewhere. That you're trying to fool us with this story of a misunderstood genius. Because let's be realistic, if you were that brilliant, you wouldn't be pushing a squeegee at 50. Carlos looked Anderson straight in the eye, and for the first time, an almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. Dr. Whitman, may I ask you a question? Go ahead. Do you remember the data secure project that was developed by his company in 2018? Anderson blinked, confused. How did you? That project was confidential. And do you remember how he failed spectacularly 6 months after launch? It cost his clients $50 million in losses. Anderson's face paled. That has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with it. Carlos opened his notebook again, showing a specific page. Because I identified exactly where you went wrong. And I have the fix right here, developed 3 years ago when I read about the disaster in the trade journals. Anderson tried to grab the notebook, but Carlos gently closed it. This is intellectual property, Dr. Whitman. But I can give you a demonstration, if you like. Roberto banged his fist on the table, determined. I want to see everything. Patricia, cancel all afternoon meetings. Carlos, I need him to show me each of these projects. Roberto, this is crazy. Anderson protested. You're going to bet the future of the company on the fantasies of a janitor? I'm betting on the only man in this room who has managed to solve our problems, Roberto replied coldly. As the team reorganized around Carlos's ideas, Anderson watched with growing despair. His position in the company, his 6-figure salary, her reputation, everything was slipping through his fingers because of a man he had completely despised. Carlos, for his part, seemed to be quietly enjoying the situation. Every technical demonstration, every elegant solution, every precise answer was like a carefully placed chess piece. It wasn't just technical competence he was displaying, it was a meticulously planned strategy. Dr. Silva, Carlos said as he saved his files on the company computer. May I suggest something? How about we form a small team to develop these projects? I could work directly with Patricia and a few other young engineers. People with open minds. Excellent idea. Anderson, you can supervise. Actually, Carlos interrupted gently, I would prefer to work independently. Sometimes, excessive supervision can limit creativity. Anderson understood the message perfectly. He was being deliberately excluded from the company's most important project. Roberto, you can't. I can and I will. Carlos, starting tomorrow, you will have full access to our development systems. Patricia will be his liaison with the team. And Anderson, Roberto paused, staring intently at the American. You will focus on maintenance projects for the next month. Maintenance projects. It was like being demoted from executive director to administrative assistant. Anderson felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Carlos carefully stored his notebook in the inside pocket of his uniform, close to his heart. Thank you, Dr. Silva. I promise you won't regret it. As the meeting dispersed, Carlos exchanged a brief glance with Patricia, who whispered, "How did you know all this? About the old projects, about our vulnerabilities." Carlos smiled for the first time that day, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Santos, 5 years is enough time to gather a lot of information. And when you're invisible to people, they talk about very interesting things in his presence. That night, while Anderson Whitman drank alone in his apartment, trying to process how her career had fallen apart in a matter of hours, Carlos walked calmly home. But not to the modest home of a janitor. He stopped in front of an elegant building, took an access card out of his pocket, and went up to an apartment on the 15th floor. There, surrounded by 3 computer monitors and bookshelves full of technical books, Carlos finally took off his work uniform. On the wall, framed, was a degree in systems engineering from MIT. And next to it, a photo of her receiving an award as Developer of the Year from one of Silicon Valley's largest technology companies. Carlos sat down at the table, opened his laptop, and started typing. The plan was working perfectly. Anderson had taken the bait exactly as expected. And the best was yet to come. Because what no one at Technova knew was that Carlos hadn't just been observing the company for 5 years. He had studied every employee, mapped every process, and collected information that went far beyond simple technical vulnerabilities. And Anderson Whitman, with her arrogance and contempt, had just become the perfect target for a lesson she would never forget. 3 days later, Technova's meeting room was packed. Roberto had summoned all the directors, investors, and specialized media to present the revolutionary banking security system developed by Carlos. Anderson watched nervously from the back of the room, her diminished position evident to everyone. Carlos entered wearing an elegant suit, no longer the janitor's uniform. She carried a leather briefcase and a laptop, her posture upright and confident. "Gentlemen, today we are going to see something that will completely change the national financial market." The presentation began flawlessly. Carlos explained each component of the system with a technical clarity that impressed even the most experienced experts. The graphs on the screen showed 200% greater efficiency than competitors, 60% lower costs, and virtually unbreakable security. "That's extraordinary," murmured one of the investors. "How did you manage to develop something so advanced in such a short time?" Carlos smiled discreetly. "Actually, this project was developed over 5 years. Every night, every dawn, observing, learning, perfecting." Anderson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Something about the way Carlos spoke was making him uneasy. "But before we continue," Carlos said, looking directly at Anderson, "I'd like to clarify some issues regarding technical competence that have been raised recently." The screen changed, showing a detailed analysis of the Data Secure project from 2018. "Dr. Whitman, do you remember this project? It cost customers $50 million in losses." Anderson paled. That's irrelevant to." "It's entirely relevant," Carlos continued calmly, clicking to the next screen. "Because here are the internal reports that his company buried. And here are the messages you exchanged with customers, promising features you knew were impossible to deliver." The room fell completely silent. On the screen, Anderson's incriminating emails appeared one by one, showing how he had deliberately omitted critical system flaws to speed up the launch and receive performance bonuses. "How did you get access to this?" Anderson stammered, standing up abruptly. Carlos opened his briefcase and took out an official document. "Because I was the technical consultant discreetly hired by the law firm that represented the victims of Data Secure. 5 years investigating every detail of his failed project." The bomb had exploded. Roberto leaned forward, shocked. The investors began whispering among themselves. A journalist began typing furiously on his laptop. "For 5 years," Carlos continued, her voice maintaining the devastating calm, "while working as a janitor here, I was collecting evidence. Not just about Technova's technical vulnerabilities, but about the actual qualifications of certain people." The next screen showed Anderson's resume, but now with red annotations highlighting every exaggeration, every project incorrectly attributed to he, every merit stolen from subordinates. The project that Dr. Whitman presented as his own on his first day here? It was developed by a team of 6 engineers whom he fired as soon as he received the credit. I have the original employment contracts and internal communications from the previous company. You set yourself up with your arrogance and her contempt. I just documented it. How could a janitor know something that our team of experts couldn't figure out? Carlos repeated Anderson's words from the previous week, her voice laden with irony. Maybe because some of us actually studied, instead of just stealing credit from others. The room was in complete chaos. Cameras were rolling, investors were making urgent phone calls, and Anderson was visibly defeated, cornered by irrefutable evidence of years of incompetence and professional fraud. Dr. Silva, Carlos said, turning to Roberto, I have a proposal. I can take over as technical director and implement not only this system, but also correct all the vulnerabilities I have identified in the company's other projects. Or I can take my research to one of the competitors who have already shown interest. Roberto did not hesitate for a second. Anderson, his firing is final. Security, please escort Dr. Whitman out of the building immediately. Anderson was led out of the room amid camera flashes and whispers of contempt. Her 15-year career had been destroyed in 20 minutes of meticulously planned presentation. Carlos remained in the center of the room, now surrounded by investors eager to learn more about her projects. But his eyes followed Anderson as he was escorted out, and for the first time, a genuine smile appeared on her face. Gentlemen, said Carlos, turning his attention to the fascinated audience, let's talk about the future of Brazilian technology. Because what you saw today was just the first project of many that he has in development. As the presentation continued and million-dollar contracts began to be discussed, one question hung in the air. How did one man manage to plan such a perfect revenge over 5 years, while remaining completely invisible? And more importantly, if Carlos was capable of such strategy and patience, what other secrets did he still hold about her true identity and her plans for the future of Tecnova? 6 months later, Fortune Brazil magazine featured Carlos on its cover with the headline From Janitor to Billionaire, the genius who revolutionized national technology. Inside his office on the 40th floor of the Tecnova Tower, he watched the city through the bulletproof glass, smiling discreetly as he read the headlines. The company had become the undisputed leader in banking security in Latin America. The systems developed by Carlos now processed more than 5 billion in daily transactions, generating astronomical profits for Tecnova and setting new global standards for efficiency. Dr. Mendez, said Patricia, entering the office, we just closed the deal with the European Central Bank. 400 million euros for the next 3 years. Carlos nodded, without taking his eyes off the window. Down below, in the square in front of the building, he could see a middle-aged man sitting on a bench, holding a sign, Experienced engineer needs work. Anderson Whitman had tried to get a job at dozens of companies in recent months. But the recordings released by Carlos, showing her racist and fraudulent behavior, had circulated throughout the tech industry. No company wanted to associate her brand with his name. Patricia, Carlos said softly, have HR offer an administrative assistant job to that man in the square. Minimum wage, but with the possibility of growth if he demonstrates humility and competence. Patricia looked out the window and recognized Anderson immediately. Are you sure? After everything he's done. Everyone deserves a second chance to prove they can change, Carlos replied, finally turning away. The difference is that this time, he'll start where he should have started from the beginning, from scratch with humility. A week later, Anderson accepted the position. He had no choice. Her savings had been depleted, and the luxurious apartment had been sold to pay off debts. She now lived in a studio apartment in the suburbs and took 2 buses to get to work. On his first day, when Anderson walked into the office wearing a cheap suit and carrying a plastic briefcase, Carlos was at the reception desk talking to some international investors. Their eyes met for a second. Welcome to the team, Anderson, Carlos said cordially, extending his hand. I hope this will be a very valuable learning experience for him. Anderson shook his hand, her cheeks red with embarrassment and gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Mendez. I won't disappoint him. I know you won't, Carlos smiled genuinely. Because now you understand that competence and character have no color, social class, or surname. They only have results. Months passed. Anderson, working humbly as an administrative assistant, watched Carlos being interviewed by international journalists, closing million-dollar deals, and being honored by the government for her contribution to national technology. During one of these interviews, a journalist asked, "Dr. Mendez, how would you define your leadership philosophy?" Carlos thought for a moment before answering, "I have learned that true revenge is not to destroy those who have harmed you. It is to build something so extraordinary that her achievements become the mirror in which her detractors see their own limitations. It is to prove that talent, intelligence, and character do not depend on origin, color, or social class, but rather on determination and integrity." Anderson, who was organizing documents at a nearby table, stopped to listen. Her hands trembled slightly as she processed those words. "What about the prejudice you faced?" the journalist continued. "Every act of prejudice I suffered became fuel for his determination. They tried to make him invisible, but he didn't know that invisible people see and hear everything. They used his humility against him, not realizing that true humility is the basis of all lasting greatness." That night, when the office was empty, Anderson found Carlos still working. He took a deep breath and approached the desk. "Dr. Mendez, can I talk to you?" Carlos looked up, kindly. "Of course, Anderson. What do you need?" I want to apologize. Truly. For everything. For my prejudice, for his arrogance, for trying to humiliate a man who is much better than me." Her words came out stumbling, laden with genuine regret. Carlos leaned back in his chair. "Anderson, we all make mistakes. What defines our character is not our mistakes, but what we do after we recognize them. How can you treat me with dignity after all this, His Lordship?" Carlos smiled softly. "Because I've learned that holding on to anger is like holding hot coals and waiting for someone else to get burned. And mainly because I've discovered that the greatest victory is not defeating an enemy, but transforming him into someone better." Anderson left the office that night with tears in his eyes, carrying a lesson that would change her life forever. Carlos remained there, watching the city lit up through the window. From invisible janitor to visionary CEO, he had proven that the greatest twists and turns in life come not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who build the most solidly. The best revenge is not to repay the damage suffered, it is to achieve the success that his enemies could never imagine, and use that success to elevate not only yourself, but the entire society around you. Have you ever faced prejudice because of her background or appearance? Leave a comment about how you reacted and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that intelligence, determination, and character always win, no matter where she came from or how she started.